Hey, welcome to Black Rock. My name is Dan and I'm on staff here. Before the sermon starts, I want to take a second to invite you to join us in person if you're able. We have a thriving and diverse community of Christ followers that meets in person every week on Sunday morning. If you have any questions about visiting or about our church in general, feel free to check out blackrock.org/visit. Now, here's the sermon.
Well, good morning. Great to have you here. So today we are talking about one of the most controversial and misused passages in the entire Bible. It is a passage that has been misused to abuse and oppress people. And as I was preparing for this sermon, I thought, Pastor Kevin did such a great job the last 2 weeks. Maybe he should preach this week too on this controversial passage. But instead, I get to preach, and I'm actually excited about it because when we properly understand this passage, when we understand what it's really saying, when we don't just kind of take out a piece and misuse it, it actually is an incredibly powerful passage. And it's important for us because it's something that actually is incredibly needed in our culture. It is also a good teaching time for us to understand that you can't just pull out a piece. You have to understand what's really going on in this passage. And so are you ready? No, too bad. We can't read it yet, okay? Because we need to set the scene a little bit for where we are. So I need to hold you in suspense for a little bit more. Now, I need to remind us of where we are in this study in the book of Colossians, okay? We are getting toward the end of this book of Colossians, and last week we took a turn because we hit chapter 3. The first 2 chapters in the book of Colossians are understanding how amazing Jesus is and really understanding our relationship with Christ. That Jesus is the creator and the sustainer of the universe who died for us, and we can actually have a relationship with Jesus. That's the first 2 chapters, being amazed at how amazing Jesus is. And then in chapter 3, we take a turn, and now it's okay, what does it look like to live believing and surrendering to Jesus? This amazing Jesus we read about for 2 chapters. What happens when we actually believe, when we're empowered to live like that? And so it turns much more practical about how does this apply to our everyday life. And last week, Pastor Kevin started chapter 3, and he read some verses that are incredibly important. In fact, I need to read a selection of those verses because they set the tone for what we're going to read today. Okay, so let me just read those for us. Colossians 3, chapter 1. This is what Pastor Kevin talked about last week. It says this: since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. Rid yourself of such things as anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion and kindness, and humility and gentleness and patience. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule your hearts. Let the message of Christ dwell among you. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father. Last week, Pastor Kevin talked about how these verses are the mindset of someone who believes and has surrendered to Jesus. If you believe in who Jesus is, this amazing God who loves us so much, who offers that we can be a child of God, if you actually believe in Jesus, if you're surrendered to saying, I want to follow Jesus, what happens is our mindset becomes more like this. Now, we have to intentionally set our minds on Christ, set our heart on Christ. It doesn't always happen naturally. We have a sinful nature that fights against this, but this is what God empowers us to do, to have this mindset. And the next passage we're going to read assumes that everyone that we're going to talk about has this mindset. Everybody has this mindset. Now, here's what this mindset will look like in everyday relationships. Here we go. Here's this week's passage. Colossians 3:18 says this: wives, Submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes are on you to curry favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. So this passage applies that mindset. It says, hey, if you have that mindset of set on Christ that we just read about, if you have that, this is what it looks like in specific relationships. Now, the overall point of this whole passage is that a Christ-centered mindset actually enhances every relationship. A Christ-centered mindset enhances every relationship. When we set our minds on Christ, when we set our hearts on Christ, it makes the relationships work the way God intended them to work. And it breaks it down into three specific relationships. It talks about wives and husbands, it talks about children and parents, and it talks about employees and bosses. Now you will notice I changed the phrase slaves and masters to employee and bosses. I think that is the better interpretation for us. Now, as I mentioned, these passages have been misused and are very controversial. And the reason is because people took out a little phrase. If you just take out the phrase, wives, submit to your husbands, and just take out the phrase, slaves, obey your masters, you can horribly misuse these passages. And they have been horribly misused to abuse and oppress people. But this is not what these passages say. And let me break down a little bit what they say by looking at each and every one of these three relationships. First, that relationships of wives and husbands. So Colossians 3:18 says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting for the Lord, and husbands, love your wives, do not be harsh with them. Now, this is not the only time that Paul breaks down these relationships. In another letter that he wrote, remember this is a letter to the church in Colossae, in another letter he wrote to the church at Ephesus, he also breaks down these same relationships. And it's really important to look at that. That actually, Colossians is sort of the Spark Notes version. The Ephesians goes into it a little bit more, so it's really helpful to look at that. And one of the things that's really helpful in the book of Ephesians is that he starts the passage with a phrase, it's up there, Ephesians 5:21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then it goes into the same things, husband love your wives, submit to your husbands, husbands love your wives. Now the reason this is really important is people get very hung up on that word submit. Right? They get hung up on that word submit. It says, why does it say wives submit to your husbands? Now ultimately, submitting is not harder than loving or anything, but the whole point of this is, it also says husbands submit to your wives. Right? It says submit to each other. So that word submit is not just for wives. It's actually husbands are also submit to their wives. And in other places, it says wives should love their husbands. So the point of this passage is not wives are supposed to do one thing and husbands are supposed to do another thing. That's not the point of this passage as well. Husbands are also supposed to submit their wives. Wives are also supposed to love their husbands. The point of this passage is a Christ-centered marriage is built on serving, not scorekeeping. Christ-centered marriages are built on serving and not scorekeeping. The point of this passage is that if you set your mind on Christ, what that does for your relationship is it focuses you on serving each other, not scorekeeping with each other. True marriages are built on mutual sacrifice. And the way that we're able to do this is we focus on who Jesus is. We realize that Jesus sacrificed for us. He came into this world and sacrificed for us. He gave up everything he had in heaven. He gave up his entire life. In fact, in Ephesians, it says husbands are supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. The model for what husbands and wives are supposed to be doing in marriage is Jesus, who sacrificed his entire life. So the way that a Christian marriage works is that husbands and wives are fighting over who gets to sacrifice more. But our sinful nature turns marriage into scorekeeping. right? I took the trash out 5 times. You only took it out once. I did the dishes 10 times. You only did it 3 times. I cleaned up. That's what our sinful nature does. It turns our marriages into scorekeeping. And this says, no, the biblical view of marriage is actually mutually fighting over who gets to serve the other person more. So here's how Paul, in my view, this is the Josh translation, would have interpreted this verse, okay? So I want you to imagine the scenario. A husband and wife are off at work all day, and they're tired. They come home from work. They have to pick up their 3 or 5 kids. In my case, you had to pick up 5 kids. You bring them home. You picked them up from school, and now you got to feed them and bathe them and put them apart. And then there's like emails from the school, and you got schedules you got to coordinate, and you got all this going on. And you get home, and the husband and wife get home incredibly tired, frustrated on the day, a little annoyed, and the husband comes to the wife and says, hey, honey, I know you've had a hard week of work. Why don't you get a massage and your favorite food? I'll take care of the kids. Let me ask any married women out there, do you have any problem submitting to your husband? Do you have any problem submitting to a husband that says, hey, you go get a massage? Now, the wife's response, according to this passage, is, no, honey, you go out with your buddies. And I know it's humorous, but this is actually the way this is working in here. This is Paul's vision of that the husband and wife say, hey, your needs are more important than my own. We will fight against who gets to serve us more. Now, we all know this doesn't happen a lot in relationships. This is not easy. However, the motivation for doing that, the only way we can begin to get close to that is when we set our hearts and our minds on Christ. That's the way this type of relationship works. It's not about focusing on what the other person is doing. It's saying, hey, Jesus sacrificed for me, so I can sacrifice for my spouse. That's the way a Christ-honoring, Christ-centered marriage is set to work. And that's why it's so important that we set our mind and our hearts on Christ. That's how it impacts our everyday relationships. Now, I do want to say, I know there are people in this room right now who are struggling in their marriage. And my encouragement to you is, first of all, to just ask yourself, where is your mindset? Do you have a Christ-centered mindset when you're looking at your spouse or not? And I want to encourage you to ask and pray that God would help give you a Christ-centered mindset in your own marriage. Now, there are times when we need help resetting our mindset. It's tough. We've gotten ourselves into a pattern. Things have been done that are really rough. And so I want to encourage you, if you're here and you're struggling in that, to reach out and get help. If you go to the BlackRock website, there's some ways that you can get help on there. You can reach out to us as a church and find a mentor couple who will help walk you through and maybe reset your mindset. There are some really good Christian marriage books that as you read them, they help you reset your mindset. There are good Christian counselors who help you reset your mindset. Ultimately, if you are here today and you are here with your spouse and you're struggling, what Jesus says is if you reset your mindset, you can have a healthy relationship. Now, on to the next relationship that Paul mentions here, which is parents and children. Paul says in verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. In verse 21, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Now, the dynamic set up here is that Christ-centered families love, respect, and trust each other. Children are called to obey, and parents are called not to embitter. That means don't provoke. That means don't lead from anger. That means don't criticize all the time. That means don't set impossible expectations. Ultimately, if you're a parent, your kids should know that you love them, even if they don't do things the right way all the time. Because we know none of us do. So parents, don't constantly tear your kids down. Yes, you will need to correct them, but you can do that with love and with grace. But kids, it also says, yes, you should honor and obey your parents. That ultimately the role of the parent is to help guide a child. And this is built on trust. If the parents are actually trying to do the right thing, then the kid needs to trust and actually obey when their parents ask them to do something. I remember when my kids got to be that preteen stage. Right? I remember my oldest son in particular, he was always the guy. He would help out. He would jump in. Hey, you wanted to help that? Yeah. Can you help me with this? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, there was like a switch turned. And all of a sudden, this word why came out all the time. Well, why, Dad? Why me? Why do I have to do this? Why not this other person? Why do we need to do this? Like this, all of a sudden, it's like a switch turned. And it was like, why? I couldn't turn the switch off either, you know? And so we'd have multiple conversations like this that would be like, hey, I asked you, I know you don't want to do it or don't feel like you should have to do it. It's fine. You can tell me why. But if you tell me why and I listen to you and I say you have to do it, then you still have to do it. I'm not going to argue over and over again on this. I want to listen to you and I want to listen to your viewpoint, but it's my job to make a decision with your input. And once I make a decision, you got to do what I say. Now, as a parent, I have to check myself in that moment and say, am I actually focusing on Christ? Am I actually asking them to do something that's reasonable? Well, when I am, ultimately, I need to honor my children, and they need to trust and respect me as well. And now for the last relationship Paul mentions here. In verse 22, Paul says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Verse 23 is so important. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. And masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now, these verses have been used to horrifically oppress and abuse people. Horrifically. To the detriment of our society. And we need to say, hey, this is horrible. This is a horrible abuse of the Bible and God's love. Verses that were meant to help people have healthy relationships used to abuse other people. I was talking about this verse with the chairman of our elder board, Steve Thorne, and he grew up in his teens and early 20s in the 60s and 70s as an African-American man in the U.S., and he did not like Christianity because of this verse. Because this verse was used to oppress people. What was interestingly is what changed his view was that when he realized that it was also Christians who understood the whole message of the Bible, who didn't just pick out this one verse and abuse it, that actually abolished slavery. It was Christians that understood that the Bible says, no, everyone is created equal and everyone has value. It was Christians like William Wilberforce and Frederick Douglass, who actually were abolitionists, who said, no. Real Christianity says, no, you can't do this. This is wrong. And that's what's so important for us, to understand what God is actually saying here. And it is horrifically wrong that the Bible was used to oppress people. But when we understand these verses the way Paul intended, I think the better interpretation for today is actually employees and bosses. And what these verses say is that if you're a Christian employee, you should be known for being a hard worker. Right? Christian employees should be known as people of impeccable integrity. And so one of my questions for you is, are you known at your workplace as a hardworking person of incredible integrity? The Bible says that we are to go the extra mile. That is a biblical term. To go the extra mile. To do even more than we're asked of. And the reasoning behind it, the way that we do this, the motivation for this is not that I might just get a raise or a promotion or it'll make my boss happy. The reason we do this is because we are working for God. We represent God wherever we are. And so if we're a boss, we should be known for a boss who's on the side of our employees. And we're going to have some tough conversations. But that employee would know, hey, I understand you're having a tough conversation with me, but I also know you're on my side and you want the best for me. This is the relationship that employees and bosses have in Scripture. And the motivation for this, the way we're enabled to do this is because we have our hearts and minds set on Christ. The beauty of this passage is that it says that a Christ-centered mindset enhances every relationship. A Christ-centered mindset enhances every relationship. It enhances marriages. It enhances families. It enhances workplaces. When people set their minds on Christ, that verse is so important. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord. Now, some of you are going to say, Josh, you don't know my spouse. You don't know my kids. You don't know my parents. You don't know my boss. You don't know my employees. And I don't. I don't know the situation you're in. And I'm guessing it's tough. Things are not going as Paul writes them here. There's hurt. There's been mistakes. People have said things and done things that they shouldn't have. Here's what I can say with complete confidence. When your mind is centered on Christ, it will enhance those relationships. I can't promise you what the other person is going to do. They may respond to this in a beautiful way, and the relationship is restored in a beautiful way. That is very possible. We've seen it over and over again here at BlackRock. But I can't guarantee that. I can't guarantee that your spouse is going to change. I can't guarantee that your boss, that your kids, that your coworkers. But here's what I can guarantee. When you set your mind on Christ, it enables you to handle what's going on around you, and it changes the way you see them. The question is no longer, what is my spouse or boss doing that's wrong? The question is my mind centered on Christ? Am I understanding what Jesus did for me, that Jesus sacrificed his entire life for me so that I can serve someone else? That's the mentality Paul has here. And so the question I want all of us to be asking ourselves today is our heart and mind centered on Christ? Because when our heart and mind is centered on Christ, it transforms the way we see our relationships.
Thanks for tuning into our sermon here at BlackRock. I'm so glad you found us, and I hope and pray this message helped you get more connected to Jesus. Speaking of connection, if you're interested in taking your next steps towards getting connected at BlackRock, use the quick links in the description below. There you'll find links for information if you're new, for upcoming events, online giving, and more. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our podcast so you can stay up to date with everything we post. See you next week, either online or in person. Thanks for watching.